Welcome back. It is time for Talking Pints, and my guest this evening is from Portland, Oregon, and his name is Andy, but his surname has always confused me because it's N-G-O. Is it Andy Ungo? I think it's Andy No is how you pronounce it. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
It's Andy No. It's a silent G. Welcome to Talking Pints.
Thank you for having me on.
Good to see you. Now, yours is a great story. Your parents from Vietnam, coming out of some pretty appalling conditions and becoming political refugees, effectively, in America.
Yes, my parents were from the former South Vietnam, and they became political prisoners after the collapse of the South Vietnamese government. They were sent to labor camp, prison camp, re-education camp, as it was formerly called. And they was part of a very large diaspora of Vietnamese who fled on boats to refugee camps in neighboring countries and applied for asylum in the West, and eventually was legally, and through a long process, settled in the United States. And a number of years later, I was born. So
genuine refugees, in every sense of the word.
Yes.
And how many Vietnamese finished up in America?
I believe through the late 70s and throughout the early 90s, the United States took in nearly 1 million refugees from Vietnam, including their family members that were later settled.
A huge number of people. Now, Portland, Oregon, you're way out there on the west. It's a fantastic, beautiful part of the world. And I'd imagine, you know, a pretty fabulous place to grow up and to be educated. And yet, if we look at Portland, Oregon today, it is, would it be fair to say that it's descended into a level of lawlessness that would have been incomprehensible even 10 years ago?
Yes, I think Portland, Oregon, where I'm from, is a microcosm of what happens when the policies that are inspired by so-called BLM and so-called anti-racism is instituted at a state level. What we've seen just since after George Floyd died is that the city is now experiencing historic surges in violent criminality, in homicides, in shootings. The mayor of Portland just last week declared a state of emergency over the number of people who have been shot and killed because it's never been this high. Portland is just one of more than a dozen cities in the United States who are also experiencing similar trends towards violence.
I've got friends in Chicago. You know, I was in commodities before I was involved in this politics and media world. And Chicago now, people don't go out at night. I mean, Chicago was, when I used to go to Chicago, it was the most amazing, fantastic social whirl of people. So it's happening all over America.
It is. And those who should be apologizing to the public over their demands of abolishing police, defunding police, demonizing police, well, they're nowhere to be found. In fact, many of them have dug into their heels and say that the reason why we're experiencing these higher numbers of deaths, predominantly of black and brown people, is because our agenda is not fully realized. In fact, we need to go further. It's not enough to defund the police. You have to abolish the police. And ultimately, if you go further and further into the goal, what they really want to do is to abolish the United States. They don't view the United States as a legitimate state. That's why they say it's systematically racist. It's on occupied land. They want to revise the history of the United States.
We're getting some of this over here too, Andy. Don't worry. You know, we're getting Churchill was awful and
exactly. Courtesy of America. There's an export. That's what America's exporting around the world.
We catch everything from America. We get the good stuff and we get the bad stuff. What was it that politicized you? What was it specifically that politicized you?
Well, I started off as a student journalist at a university in Portland State. And I just wanted to report on what I was witnessing. I was working for the student newspaper when Trump was announced as the winner in 2016. And my city was on fire for several days. Tens of thousands of people took to the streets to declare that election illegitimate without evidence. And that
some would say that's happening this time round with Trump the other way. But hey, keep going, keep going.
They rioted for 3 days, and the response from the liberal establishment was that rage was legitimate, and political violence, when carried out for left-wing causes, is legitimate.
All about means and ends, yeah.
And I sought to just document the violence with my mobile phone and post it on social media. And eventually I learned very quickly about Antifa. And, I'm sitting in front of you today as an independent journalist, but according to my detractors, they say I'm one of the most dangerous people in America who has to be eliminated. And that's partially why we're doing this interview in London and me not in Portland, is because I've been subjected to so much violence against myself and death threats that it is very dangerous for me to be there. Nothing
justifies the death threats, the violence, and frankly the fact that you've had to leave home and come to live in London for your own safety and for the safety of your family. I understand that and get that, but Andy, I put it to you, you are quite an effective sort of agent provocateur, aren't you? And some of the people that you've been out with, mixed with, you've covered, whether it's the Proud Boys or groups like this, I mean, they're pretty far out there, aren't they?
Yeah, so I disagree with the characterization that I'm a provocateur. I think I have been on the ground covering brawls and riots and violence from people who of all political persuasions. And my detractors have sought to cast that as evidence that I was embedded or part of certain right-wing groups. I've always rejected that.
So would you argue then that when you attended, whether it's an Antifa demonstration or a Proud Boys demonstration, would you argue you were doing that as a journalist?
Absolutely. The footage all of it was posted on my social media. And nobody applies that same type of standard to, let's say, left-wing journalists who communicate and travel with Antifa Black Bloc groups. They're still given the label of journalists. I actually don't go with any group. I show up on my own. And because I'm neutral, actually, this is the main issue, is my detractors want to take me down because I refuse to condone political violence against the right, that somehow makes me then a supporter of right-wing extremism. It's absolutely untrue.
Now, you read a book about all this, Unmasked, Inside Antifa and the Threat to Democracy, and it's a book that it sold very well. People were fascinated by what you'd done. It was an expose on Antifa. Here in the UK, Antifa is not that well known. But something happened here a couple of years ago, and it was following the death of George Floyd, or murder, we should say, more accurately under the law, of George Floyd. Within 24 hours, there were organised demonstrations taking place just over the river here. Police officers taking the knee, and I, much lesser extent than you, but I went on mainstream British media to say, be careful. By all means talk about equality of opportunity in society, but don't lionise. Don't say BLM are a wonderful organisation. Just read their website. And nobody did. And lots of us finished up getting cancelled. So, I know the feeling with what it's like. What is BLM? Explain to people, what is BLM? You've looked at this, you've researched this. What are their real aims and objectives?
So BLM, the actual organization, was founded by 3 Black American women who are self-identified Marxists. And a number of reports have come out about particularly one of them, her multi-million-dollar estate empire in the United States, how tens of millions of dollars that were donated were allegedly misused. So they're dealing with their own legal issues right now in the United States. And I think ultimately that may be the legacy of the BLM, actual, capital BLM organization. The broader movement itself, though, if you go to any of their demonstrations, as I have, you'll see that they will recite the poetry of communist terrorists like Assata Shakur. They will wear shirts and have signs with her image on it because they actually they admire the domestic terrorism of past communist terrorists in the United States. And of course, as you said, if you went on their website a number of years ago and looked at what they're actually calling for.
It was all there, and mainstream media chose not to look.
Correct. And if you dared to challenge it, as I have, you are treated as a blasphemer.
Yeah.
And the same thing applies to Antifa. If you go against them, You're then
Well, agreeing with anything. I mean, it was extraordinary. Winston Marshall, Mumford & Sons, enormously successful musician. You know, he read your book and posted on social media that it was a book we should read and it was great work. And he's finished up leaving the band because of the hatred that he's received. Andy, where do we go with all of this? I mean, I look at America, I look at what's happening. As I say, you know Portland better than I do, but I do know those other big cities, and I do know friends that are leaving and getting out, and they're going to Miami or Texas or wherever else they're going. What is America's future? I mean, is this division going to lead to large-scale civil violence, or is there a means by which some common sense can prevail and some understanding that both sides of an argument are valid?
I'm not optimistic about where America's heading. I think what we are witnessing is that certain federal agencies are being used, weaponized against certain segments of the American population that the current administration shares a mutual enemy with. We see over and over a sort of two-tier system in many jurisdictions where if you are accused or arrested or suspected of committing far-left political violence, your case gets dropped or dismissed by prosecutors who are elected and are trying to appeal to a certain constituency who have been entirely affected by this brain virus, mind virus, of far-left political violence. So where do we go from here? Well, where I go is that I continue to defend the values of liberal democracy and freedom of expression and freedom of speech. I know these things sound like cliches, but ultimately this is what the violent far left are trying to take down. Their argument is that those who disagree with them, regardless of where that other person may be politically, they need to be shut down through the use of violence. And this sickness is not confined to just American universities anymore. It's spread out to every segment of society, and we're seeing the consequences of that.
It's very depressing. Final quick thought. Donald Trump making it almost clear yesterday that he's going to run. Does he help this situation? Is he part of the solution, or does he inflame it even more?
What happened in 2016 when he was announced as a winner, that really broke the mainstream left. It radicalized them. And I'm afraid of how they would respond again to another Trump campaign. And this is completely independent of what Trump may say or do. It almost doesn't really matter. The fact of his mere existence, the fact that the American right wants to organize and be part of this political process in the minds of the far left is inexcusable, unacceptable, and must be shut down by any means necessary.
Andy, you have stood up. You've been brave. You paid a fairly big price for what you've done. And I thank you for coming on Talking Pints. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.